All right. Welcome everyone to today's special webinar where myosh, together with Skodel, presents integrating safety management with employee wellbeing. My name is Christina, and on behalf of myosh, I'm delighted to have you join us for what promises to be an insightful and engaging session. Joining me today is Ian Fagan, Director of Skodel. And in today's rapidly evolving work environment, adopting a holistic approach that prioritises both safety and wellbeing is just essential. And so today we have an exciting lineup of topics and expert insights to share with you all. This webinar is designed to ensure you gain valuable insights and actionable knowledge. Whether you're a safety professional, HR manager, organisational leader, this session will equip you with the tools and understanding needed to foster a safer and more supportive workplace. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to everybody that has registered. So if you need to leave halfway through, or if you know somebody that will actually get some really good information from today's session, we'll have it available for you all to watch on our social media accounts, YouTube, our website, and like I said, I'll email it out to you all after this. Finally, I just want to let you know to please be as interactive as possible. We have the chat box open, the Q&A box open, and we will throw to you all throughout. So if you have any questions, pop them down. We'll be more than happy to answer those for you. Okay, so let's not wait any longer. Let's pass the mic over to Ian and let's get started.
Thank you, Christina. I'm just going to share my screen, and whilst I do that, as Christina mentioned, it is designed to be interactive. So along the way, if you do have questions, just pop them in the chat box and we'll do our best to answer them at the end. But my name's Ian, and as Christina mentioned, I'm one of the directors at Skodel. And if you went to Skodel's website now, you'd see that we have a strong focus on psychosocial safety, positive duty regulations. However, it wasn't always the case. And in fact, our journey started in wellbeing. So throughout this discussion today, I want to just talk a bit about that journey and the decision that we made to shift focus into much more of a focus on psychosocial safety and what that meant in terms of overall mental health outcomes and business objectives too. To do that, I'll be covering some of these topics here. And I wanted to start with this foundational work, which is to actually understand the differences between these key elements. So to do this, let's imagine a situation. So put yourself in the shoes of you're an employee and you've been tasked with lots of complex projects at the same time that have really tight deadlines. And the implications for not achieving these might be quite significant. You also have a pretty unique skill set, so there's lack of support around you to be able to actually review your work or assist in that process. Now, whilst all this is happening around you, you're then introduced to a new wellbeing initiative which focuses on yoga or mindfulness to de-stress. For many, that might be seen as okay, but for some in those situations where they feel like a lot of the reason for the stress is from organizational dynamics, this is where wellbeing initiatives might not land as effectively as we want them to do because they're trying to counteract a psychosocial hazard here. And so that's essentially why we've put psych safety and positive duty here as the foundational blocks for starting this work, because when we operate in an environment where there is psychosocial safety, which essentially looks at addressing root causes, the dynamics within our organizations that might be contributing to mental ill health and poor well-being, and getting that right first before we then introduce well-being initiatives, so they're not trying to counteract those, but instead are promoting good health. And the combination of these two done effectively ultimately is going to lead to more effective or better mental health outcomes. To kick off the first poll today, Christina, I was hoping we could ask the audience around, when we think about these elements then and thinking about those definitions there, where do we feel we as organizations or our organizations are currently focusing most of the time? Is it on psychosocial safety, well-being, mental health, or neither of these?
So you'll notice I've popped up that poll there for everybody to answer. But Ian, what do you find, like if you were to come across this when people you deal with, what do you find people come to you most?
Yeah, I think there's at the start a bit of confusion about the difference initially between
That's what I was going to
psychosocial.
say. Do you want to explain exactly what psychosocial safety means?
Yeah, so psychosocial safety really is looking at the organizational dynamics, and this is specifically work-related things. So, those things I mentioned in that scenario about you're being put under immense pressure to deliver highly complex work, and there's limited support around you, really tight deadlines, and this starts to have an impact on your mental health. Those are psychosocial safety environmental settings or factors that can impact your mental health. Well-being
Mm-hmm.
is better seen at a more individual level. So your
Mm-hmm.
individual
It's
level of
different to
well-being.
everybody, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And they interact differently. And in those situations as well, someone's perception of those factors or those factors interacting may not be causing significant impacts as there is a subjective element to this as well. But we want to understand with psychosocial safety whether those issues are really prevalent and what sort of impact they might be having on our teams. So it's seen as at a more system level.
Right. So the results from the poll are in. The majority of people feel that their organisation focuses most on well-being. So that was 55% of our audience at the moment believe that. Coming in second was psychosocial safety. Third, mental health, and 9% of people, unfortunately, said they don't focus on anything.
Yeah, and that's also something that we're seeing as well. I had a good analogy recently where there's a lot of talk, obviously, now about psychosocial safety regulations, positive duties, but in some respects, it's like a mechanic telling you that your car's broken and you're not a mechanic, and all you know is that it's broken. You have this obligation to do something, but it's pretty hard sometimes to know what to do. So hopefully, throughout this webinar, we can unpack some of those steps. But we do see probably a greater focus on well-being, and I want to now talk about our journey from well-being into psychosocial safety, and why we feel that it's really important to make sure that we get the right balance here. So if we think about then psychosocial safety at a system level, and maybe well-being can be seen more at an individual level, one of the biggest challenge that we personally faced in our years of doing well-being work with organizations was engagement in that process, because it came down ultimately to an individual's appetite to want to do something about their own well-being. And there are multi-billion-dollar companies spending enormous amounts of money to have Matthew McConaughey and LeBron James talking to you about well-being and those sorts of things. And even in elite level sporting organizations that we've worked with, we saw at times it was 10% take up. And so ultimately, when we reflected on that, what are our responsibilities as leaders, and how are we then going to actually have the biggest impact on mental health outcomes? We felt that it's not necessarily our responsibility as leaders to have people engage in looking after their own well-being, but at a system level, we need to make sure that we're creating dynamics where people can actually look after their own well-being and give them the best chance to work on that. And so that's why, as a business, we decided to shift our focus to more of the system level approaches here. And the processes involved in that might look at the Safe Work Code of Practice around identifying, assessing risks, and controlling and reviewing those risks. And it's all aimed at controlling root causes of mental harm. That said, as I touched on in that pyramid, there's obviously merit to wellbeing initiatives, and I think we just need to be mindful of what sort of initiatives we bring on, what their evidence base might be, just so that we make sure that we get the best return on our investment. There's obviously time and cost involved in this, and through our work, what we found to be an effective wellbeing initiative was actually volunteer charity work. There's a lot of research out there around the positive impacts around the morale boost across teams, stress reduction, in terms of longevity stress reduction, rather than a mindfulness app, which can be initially the initial take up, and then it might sort of fade off. So it can be pretty hard to sustain. But there's also a greater sense of purpose here in team unity, which we see wellbeing initiatives being a great vehicle to drive that team unity work that we do, whilst equipping ourselves with some important wellbeing skills.
I know even just within myself, when you do something for someone just because, with no expectations or no wanting them to owe you something, essentially, like just to help out, there is such an immense happiness and joy that it gives myself. So when you go that step further and actually do volunteer charity work like this, it's of course it's a no-brainer that it's going to boost your morale and it's going to reduce your stress and give you a greater sense of purpose. I completely agree with this.
Yeah. So we weigh up what are the right initiatives to do, and when do we feel it's the right time to introduce these initiatives. I think those are some of the key points when we consider the wellbeing and safety side of things. Equally, there are challenges to the psychosocial safety. And so with positive duty and psych regs coming out, I think there's, as we touched on, there's confusion, and some of the misconceptions in the market might be psychosocial safety is just about mental health programs and EAP. We spoke about that just now. It's obviously looking at the root causes more than just equipping someone with an EAP, for example, a line to call. The other one, which might happen a lot at the board level, is we're going to be less productive because we can't hold people accountable. And this is basically essentially just allowing employees to do whatever they want, whenever they want. I'm going to talk about how our RMIT addresses this, but this is actually in the regulations, that it's about balancing business objectives and doing what's reasonably practicable for you as an organization. We still need to be able to hold people accountable. We still need to be able to have KPIs and deadlines and things like that. And there will be levels of stress. That's just part of doing it.
I have a question here, Ian, if you don't mind. I think it's a good time to ask it. From Clay, has asked, effective wellbeing is a result of culture and leadership. In saying that, is there sufficient focus on exactly how we improve mental health and wellbeing by addressing the real symptoms, so the root causes like you were talking about?
I think if we go back to that pyramid, that foundational block is about building those processes into, okay, so what are we going to then be doing within the organization to actually improve mental health outcomes? I would say that there's probably a bit more research to be done in terms of building an evidence base around that and what are the exact approaches, because there's requirements, but there's no requirements on how you do it. So I think we'll explore a bit about that in this webinar.
Amazing.
The last point I have here, and thanks, Clay, for the question. The last point I have here is, this perception that there's a lot of people out there taking advantage of the system and lodging claims, and there's no doubt that this is happening. We see it happen a lot more if there's redundancies needing to be made and other things like that, and people are going into financial uncertainty. And they want to take advantage then of the system. So that's a legitimate concern here. But I guess ultimately that leads us to this question of then who is going to be responsible for looking after this? We have HR and safety leaders here. And what we're finding out there at the moment is that there are, there's this, no, this is HR's responsibility, no, this is safety's responsibility. And what that can do is lead to then inaction. And so I want to talk about then the roles here. And actually, Clay, I was speaking with Clay a couple of weeks ago, and he made the comment about, and Clay's safety specialist, he made the comment about how it's HR and safety are actually aligned in a common mission here, which is keeping people safe and supporting their well-being. And I thought that was a very good reflection. And when I thought about that a bit more, one of the things that I see break down is the approaches taken to achieve this overarching goal here are often very different. And we can at times operate in silos. And I'll give you an example of that, at times there can be misalignment. So if we look at consultation is a key part of the code of practice. We need to consult with workers, and how that might be done at the moment through HR, from an HR lens, is culture and engagement surveys. But what we get off the back of that might be job satisfaction data, it might be engagement in the work and those sorts of things. Taking that data and then putting it into a risk assessment or safety framework is very challenging. And we only get a certain amount of times that we can actually consult with our workforce. We can't survey them to death and have focus groups all the time. So this is where I think a good example where we need to make sure that we start to align this so that it feeds up to an overarching safety and risk management framework. And a reason for that, a very good reason, is obviously that it's in the code of practice, and consultations are a really key part of that. And you can see on the left here a case where Baker's Delight was investigated. And this investigation didn't come off the back of any lodging of claims or anything like that. The reason that the Commission selected Baker's Delight was retail was seen as high risk. Franchise arrangements can pose complexities here. And so the investigation was launched. And then it goes back to that question of then who would be responsible in this case for communicating to the Commission what's being done from a psychosocial safety standpoint. The investigation found that there were gaps in Baker's Delight Holdings compliance with this, and particularly around the conducting of appropriate assessments for these risks, centrally recording these reports, and surveying workers to understand the prevalence. So that surveying workers to understand the prevalence is a good example where if we consult, we want to get data that gives us, we want to be able to get the data there that allows us to evaluate risks effectively. So this is obviously Baker's Delight, a fairly well-known franchise in Australia, but when we look at the numbers here across all workforces, we see that mental health conditions have contributed to, or mental health claims have increased 67% in the last 5 years. And if we look at the breakdown of where those are coming from, all of the physical health related ones, obviously they don't have professionals in there. But when you get to mental health conditions, it's made up by the mental health claims, it's 22% are professionals. So we're seeing this permeate into all workforces where we need to be well-skilled and well-versed in maintaining risk assessment and safety management processes, because these sorts of claims can trigger investigations. And on top of that, the other important thing to note here is the age of, so where are these claims typically coming from? And it's coming from younger generation workers. So there's obviously more of the younger generation coming in, and those aged 55 plus, who only made 24% of the claims, are on the way out. So this is likely to increase.
I wonder if that's a generational thing. I know my parents and their parents, they're all very much just get on and deal with it. Just put your head in the sand. This is what it is. Don't question things. Just deal with it. Whereas as the generations go through the workforce, I find that more and more people are sticking up for themselves, and they're more self-aware, and they're more aware of things and what they mean and what we can do to fix ourselves and help ourselves. And I wonder if that has something to do with the fact that over 55-year-olds are less likely to contribute to these numbers.
Yeah, there is generational factors at play here. There's no doubt. And, that approach, I guess, of just harden up and things like that was
Yeah.
sort of probably a bit more prominent in that age group. And so
Mm.
there are legitimate, I guess, concerns where there's probably a bit of a division in terms of what the younger generation might be perceiving as happening around support for mental health and well-being, as opposed to
Mm.
the older generation of workers. So it's an
I
important
guess,
dynamic to note.
yeah. And I guess the whole term that you use, consultation, whilst it's so important, I think the underlying word here and the root of all consultation just comes down to communication. I think communication is key.
Mm. Yeah, and I wanted to touch on that later in the tools and technologies as well, because
Sorry, I keep
there is
jumping in.
no, that's perfect, because there is, I guess, when we talk about tools and technologies and the processes to help, ultimately it's a people thing. And
Mm.
if we can get that right, that's the best defense against all of this, and making
Mm.
sure that we're doing all that we can to support mental health and well-being. And it's a lot of this stuff that we see it's just good processes from a business standpoint, and making sure that we've got the right dynamics at play here to
That's
give
it.
ourselves the best chance.
Your business isn't going to thrive or survive if your workforce and your employees are not happy or they're being injured, whether that be emotionally, physically, or mentally.
Yeah, and I would say as well, whether we see it as right or wrong, in terms of it, there is obviously a subjective nature to this. But if we don't see, what someone perceives as bullying, or sort of being excluded from things, might be something that we don't see as a challenge or an
Mm.
issue. But what we need to understand is, if everyone starts feeling that, and if that's having a big impact, then there is a challenge at play, because those
Mm.
dynamics are not going to lead to the best workforce. So,
Right.
isolated events will happen, but we need to have thresholds in place to start to understand, okay, when does something become, reach a point where we need to consider doing something about it.
Mm.
And so when we look at, this idea of what do we do, one of the key things is obviously having a risk assessment document here, which is aiming to centralize a lot of this information and the processes that we have in place, and we're trying to feed all of this work that we're doing into this here in a meaningful way. It's not just important, obviously, in, say, Baker's Delight case, where we need to then be able to present this, but ultimately we should have structure around this so that we are achieving the best mental health outcomes. Because how do we know what we're doing is working? There are many different approaches to evaluating risks, but we have, standard 5x5 risk matrix here. And this is where we want to try and get the consultation that's going to feed into this risk matrix here. We've got on the left-hand side here, we've got prevalence, and then we've got subjective impact. How we weigh that up is to look, prevalence is about understanding the percentage of people that are experiencing it and how long this might have been happening. So what are our thresholds here for, if 5% of the workforce is experiencing that, is that very low? If 10%, 20%, at what point do we start to go, okay, this is reaching this sort of moderate level of prevalence here around the organization? We need to think about that. And also, if it's been happening for a long time, they're saying it's been happening for a long time, that obviously starts to increase the risk there. So thinking about how we get data in our consultations for prevalence of these risks that we've identified, and then the subjective impact. So we like to look at this as a person's ability to function effectively at work. If they reach a point, some people work under tight deadlines and they're fine. Some people can shut down. Obviously, when we reach that point where we can't function effectively, that's not good for anyone. So having a way to actually measure where people might be at on that scale in terms of the impact that these things might be having, then that's another important metric. Obviously, things like job demands might be high in prevalence, but it's not really impacting everyone. They're sort of functioning fine. But once it starts to go, okay, we're shutting down, that's where we need to look at what are the things that we could do now. And a dashboard similar to this is helpful, just to have an overarching view of the risks that you've identified here within your organization and be able to feed this into some sort of meaningful way so that, say, biannually or annually, you review this and see whether things are reaching moderate level thresholds, higher, and have a process for continuous review. Now, if they do reach a stage where you feel like, okay, we need to do something about this, or even before, as we're setting up the initial risk assessment, we need to document our controls in some sort of hierarchy. And there's a lot of confusion about the hierarchy for psychosocial hazards. There's different hierarchies. I know RMIT has a three-stage hierarchy. You've seen 2 stages as well. We have this, we like this one here, and it's because it closely aligns to the one that we know really well, which is obviously across the physical hazards. So there's an approach here where you could adopt the new one, or you can adapt the current one here. And so when we look at psychosocial hazards, elimination is probably going to be hard for a lot of things here. Redesign and adjust. These are things that we are changing the work environment essentially. And these are going to score higher in terms of, it just needs to be effective, but these are probably the higher order controls where regulators will look at and say, okay, you were taking, reasonable steps here to do it. If, as opposed to, say, educate, promote, if it's just in these areas here, there's probably, where it's just all on the worker, and these might be wellbeing and mental health initiatives. That may, we might need to consider what are the things that we're doing in the design of our work here to make sure that we're doing our best to sort of reduce the impact of these sorts of dynamics that could be impacting our mental health. The other part in our consultation is to ask workers about what they would see as good and reasonable actions to take. And this is the framework here, because obviously when we consider controls, we cannot do absolutely everything, and we need to have some sort of framework here. And RMIT has a really neat one here, which is to look at essentially the effort or the cost of doing these sorts of things and maintaining them and the impact that it would have. And then we need to weigh up the business objectives. It may not be feasible to do certain things. Obviously, where we ideally want to look at is some of those big hitter items, which are high impact, and there's also those quick wins as well, which can be high impact as well, and easier to implement. So having a framework for how we design controls is really important, and it's important that workers know about this as well, so that they have reasonable expectations about what can be done. Because an obvious one that stands out is inadequate reward and recognition as one of the hazards, and if you need to pay any more, that's not always possible. The resources there and obviously may not be feasible to do that. So an example control in Baker's Delight case could be around documenting the visibility and natural surveillance here. So ensuring that internal and external lighting provides good visibility, because this was in relation to sexual harassment here, and including safe entry and exit to the workplace. This hierarchy would sit on the adjustment hierarchy, and the cost of implementation might be moderate depending on things here. At the end of this webinar, Christina will thing out or provide a little poll, and if you want to hear from me around a library of controls that we're building out here, which breaks down these controls by hazard type, it drops them into hierarchy, the cost of implementation, relevant industries, we can share that with you, and it's got implementation guidelines as well. So I think the
I was going to say
controls.
this will be really handy for people that wouldn't necessarily think of understand or know what certain controls or what certain hazards would be for the psychosocial realm. So this is going to be of great use for everybody, I believe. So this is
Yeah,
exciting.
and the controls they do require a bit of creative input as well. It's just, there's a lot of this stuff you likely already have, and it's things like lack of role clarity. You've got a project management tool in place, and these sorts of things. And where does that sit in the hierarchy? Sometimes it is a bit about documentation, and hopefully something like this can help you document that so that you've got watertight documentation there around, okay, these are the things that we're doing, but also you might identify some quick wins in the list.
I think the key to having all of this sort of stuff as well, like having the controls, having the hazards, having the exact way to implement them is literally the starting point. And it then comes back to the whole consultation, communication, and making sure that the staff are aware that these things are in place, as well as continuing to maintain them. And it's that maintaining them that's the most important.
Yeah, exactly. So on that note, it'd be good to just reflect on where we feel we're at in our psychosocial hazard journey. So, is it on the agenda? Have we put it on the agenda, also conducted an initial risk assessment? Do we have adequate controls in place, and are these documented in a hierarchy? And I guess the last part, to your point, Christina, is then do you have a simple system for continuous review here as well?
I think that's important too, the word simple. We so often get caught up in jargon that just overcomplicates things. And I am forever. So obviously myosh is a safety management system and we're a technology company. And when I first started here, I think I was forever Googling words thinking, what the hell is this? And when I actually realized that the words that I was coming across were just basic terms, it's understanding the basic terms. And you just think, gosh, let's just keep things simple. Let's let it all be able for everybody to understand. And I think keeping a simple system for continuous review is so, so crucial.
Yeah, that's to me one of the key points where people, particularly at the start, and you will have to have a procedure document as well around what are your processes, and if you make those really complex and then you can't, I guess, actually enact those realistically, then that doesn't put you in a better position. It's better to
not at all
make sure that you're in the you've got simple processes to do
you
this.
You can tick the box at the end of the day and say, yes, we've got them, but it's a matter of keeping them in place, and it's a matter of making them available and maintaining them. That's the important part. To answer the poll, I'll end that now for you all. The majority of people have said that they feel that their psychosocial hazard journey is on the agenda, which is better than nothing. It's important that it's actually in the forefront of people's minds. Next up, we had conducted initial risk assessment, which is good, followed by not yet started, which we kind of hoped that would be at the bottom, but it's good that it's not at the top, I guess. And then we have 13% coming in at having adequate controls in place and documented, and 10% coming in saying they have a simple system for continuous review.
Oh, that's really good then. And when we look at that, I guess obviously the simple system part feeds us into the next section here, which is looking at those tools and systems. And some of the challenges around this are looking at process efficiency. We can very easily adopt too much here or get confused around systems, and it starts to actually be more inefficient than it is efficient. The other part is that engaging staff piece, particularly with consultation. I want to talk a bit about that and the importance of making that process simple, because we need to obviously continuously do this. that engaging staff is going to be an important part of it, and it's quite challenging at times.
Mm.
Integrating with existing systems, so going back to the consultation piece that HR might be doing, we need to then make sure that that's feeding into an overarching risk and governance or safety management framework. So just making sure this stuff is integrated. It's going to save us a lot of time and challenges in the long run, where you can obviously expose yourself to some gaps in your processes if it's not. The other part is just a general resistance to tech or other initiatives, which is obviously just part and parcel of anything new within organizations. And so how do we make this all fit seamlessly within that? So, we mentioned earlier that it's a people challenge, really, and technology can do certain parts, but ultimately, if we are just being respectful with people and supportive of each other, ultimately that's going to be the best case scenario. However, there is elements where we do need to maintain documentation and carry out this work, and I think technology can assist in these key areas. So if we look at consultation, obviously that's the gathering of this information, risk scoring and analysis. So when we evaluate the risk, we can have predefined thresholds in that. So prevalence, what makes something high prevalence, what makes something high impact, those sorts of things. Thinking about that so that we can take our consultation and put it into a good risk matrix really easily. Not doing that, I guess, it then makes that process quite lengthy each time we consult. Integration with existing systems so that it's all feeding up into a central place here. The monitoring and alerts, this can just be useful reminders, say every 6 months or a year to review things. And then maintaining a clear record of things, which sort of feeds in with that integration piece. But being able to store all of this neatly is really important.
And easy to access too when you need it.
Exactly. There was, we were speaking with someone from Bond University, and they said, that he viewed it as like having your taxes ready, and at times it might seem like, okay, I'm not going to get audited for tax, but if you do, you want to make sure that you've got your documentation there, and that's where technology can definitely help. And you're not then going to 50 different sources and emails and interview notes and things like that. It's all centrally stored and easy to show. So 3 lessons that we've learned on this journey here. The first one is about these simple processes and making it sustainable. So what we often see is year one. When we look at this, we might see we're going to do focus groups, we're going to do 70-item surveys, interviews, and a huge amount of upfront work. But then, what does the sustainable part look like? And so we get to year 2, and we think, oh goodness, we can't do that again, can we? So I think if it's not going to work long term, then there's really no need to do that. Setting up sustainable processes from the start, and that's across the board, from your consultation mechanism to scoring and what your processes for doing that, and controls as well. The other part, this is a bit of a niche one, but it pops up a lot because there's different approaches to consultation. So when we think about asking staff how things are going, we know that we can potentially get false flags. And what I mean by that, an example is, if you ask staff, are they experiencing excessive job demand, there may even be fear that if they said no and things are all, it's quite cruisy here, that might reflect badly on things. So there might be a tendency to say, oh, there's, excessive job demand. So that always gets overinflated. If we proactively ask about each risk, one thing that we like to do is actually have a filtering question so that we pick up the really accurate signals, which is understanding how are things going in the work environment for you and how you're able to function effectively. If you're going fine and you're functioning fine, then we don't need to probe about every single risk and hazard. There's different schools of thought on this, but I think, when we were talking to one of the larger organizations in Australia, and they'd done the two approaches, there was a sense that this was actually a more accurate way of getting the accurate risk signals, because that job demands one is another example. A retail worker who's asked, do they have low level control around their job? They likely will say yes, but is that a real problem that we need to be addressing? They've sort of gone in there knowing what it's about. So just being able to get the right signals here is really important in the design of our consultation.
I was going to say, if you asked me the question and one of the answers was fine, it would mean a great deal of difference to when my husband asks me that question and I say fine. Fine means a lot of different things. So filtering is a good idea.
That's right. And that's why this consultation and getting this set up neatly and effectively is important.
And context.
And happy to share insights, because we have tried lots of different approaches, and the thresholds and everything that we built out have sort of, it's been built out over time to work with leadership and our clients around, at what point are we getting accurate signals where things are becoming challenging. And
I think that's important to note as well. Like, nothing is ever going to be finished in this ecosystem, in the safety ecosystem, in the mental health and psychosocial realm. It's going to constantly evolve. I mean, things that were the norm in this area last year are not what they are today. And I mean, this was never even heard of 10 years ago. So let alone imagine what it's going to be in 10 years' time. So I think nothing's ever going to be finished, is it? It's constantly going to be evolving.
Yeah, exactly. We should have that approach of continuously improving it.
Exactly.
And as I said, happy to share insights into this area around the design of these consultation mechanisms. We've just found that, one of the challenges here is when you evaluate risk and the consultation mechanism is giving off false flags, it can actually take up resources. It could cause a lot of headaches here. So just trying to get to that point where we have a good mechanism here, and we're able to evaluate risks effectively to focus our attention on the really important areas, if there are areas that we need to consider new controls for. The last part here is just a lot of this stuff, has been spoken about from a regulation standpoint, but I think, ultimately, when we look at why people leave or quiet quit, what we've seen in our data is that there's the poor support and lack of role clarity can often be a large contributor to quiet quitting. People are unsure what to do, particularly in tough financial economic times. They'll just stay in the role, but they're unsure of what's going on, and they're just kind of, floating through. The other part is obviously inadequate reward and recognition. Obviously, financial side comes into it, but I think, that's something that there's just limited resources for us to do, or for us to spend at times. But we need to be mindful then of how we recognise what employees are doing, and being able to do this in an authentic way goes a long way and a lot further than we might initially think, to actually making sure that people stay, attached to the work that they're doing, and contributing positively to.
I was going to say, it doesn't cost anything for somebody to say a genuine thank you or a check-in on how are you. That's all free. So when cost and finances come into play, definitely, but reward and recognition doesn't necessarily have to cost the company anything. I know for myself, like if you do a good job and someone comes to you out of the blue and says, Christ, that was amazing. Like you've done really well here. Like I hope you're proud of yourself. That means more to me than any gift could. And I know everybody's different, but I think it's important for our leaders. And I guess it all, again, comes back to communication. It's important for our leaders to understand their workers and understand what makes them tick and what drives them, and to use that to their advantage. So if you know one of your staff members are not necessarily driven by money or goods or gifts, sending them a thank you, or even when they do something right, or not just letting them know when they've done something wrong, is a huge thing as well. And I think reward and recognition doesn't necessarily have to cost anything. And in terms of lack of role clarity, I think I've found personally, it depends on the size of a company. I find the smaller a company, the clarity of your role doesn't exist, because you end up being the cleaner, you end up being the receptionist, you end up being the leader at times, you end up being the salesperson, because there are limited staff and there's limited colleagues. It's hard to define a role unless you're in a bigger company, whereas you might have a defined role and you have the ability to say, that's not my job, that's X person's job, they can do that. In my experience, that's what I found. Having a smaller company leads to more ambiguous role types, I guess.
Exactly. That's just moving on to the recap side. I just thought I'd sort of sum up some of the key points that we spoke about today. And firstly, this idea of making the distinction between psychosocial safety and then wellbeing. We have the opinion that it's important to do the psychosocial safety work first and understand what that looks like before introducing wellbeing initiatives. And in doing this effectively, we need to make sure that we're aligning our HR and safety practices so that they're not siloed. That means making sure that our HR consultations and the work that we do, with HR often being the face or point of contact for a lot of our staff, that is feeding back into a risk management framework here. Having effective controls, and that's some of the stuff that Christina just mentioned there as well, even just recognition, just being human about it and having effective controls in place here is the best way to actually defend against a lot of this here. Obviously, they need to be documented in some sort of way. So just getting some alignment there around how you're actually documenting and being able to evidence that is just part of it, but ultimately try and be human about it. And then simple being sustainable. We don't need to go overly complex. I think there's the way I look at this is when we first started also in the wellbeing journey, we started work with a really prominent university, and there was a bit of a challenge, I guess, where there's things that are grounded in academic and evidence-based and things like that, but it's complex then in reality to actually get that over the line and get people engaged in it. And a good example might be 70-item surveys and things like that, where you get an over-analysis of things. It's a challenging thing for staff to fill out. And then, in theory, it's grounded in evidence, but I guess sustaining that and that working in practice can start to become challenging. So it's just setting up simple processes that can actually be sustained long term. Some of our work here, and as mentioned, Christina will put up a poll soon around if you'd like to touch base around the controls or any other things that we've spoken about. I'd be more than happy to do that.
I've got a few questions before we wrap up. Some actually awesome questions and points of view, which I've loved. So Mark has actually asked, how do you feel about pre-employment psychoanalytic approach for professionals, similar to Fit for Work pre-employment tests for physical workers? Is this common, and do you find that it works?
Look, my personal opinion on this is it's obviously it's a dicey area, and people are, I think, my personal opinion, are skilled
Mhm.
enough to get through those surveys and pre-employment tests a lot of the time, and in the end, I've seen lots of cases where, there might not be red flags popping up, and then there are red flags popping up later down the track. It's a really hard area to get right. So I guess just need to be careful about what sort of work is done in those pre-employment screenings. Yeah, I'd like to follow that up probably with a bit more information. It's something that's popped up quite a bit. It's really hard to get right.
It's hard to gauge whether somebody's being their absolute true self.
Yeah,
And I mean, nobody's going to go to an interview being their worst self, are they? And they're not
yeah,
going to tell you all their bad flaws, and they're not going to tell you all the reasons why you wouldn't hire someone. So why would they tell you in one of those pre-employment
yeah,
checks? However, like you said, you have to be so careful with what you ask prior, because you just you never know. You never know.
yeah.
I love that question. And Leanne, sorry if I've pronounced that wrong, has said further to Mark's question, when flags have become apparent in the pre-employment stage, what are your thoughts on how best to approach/manage these workers if employed? So exactly what you said.
Yeah, I would say it comes down to communication and
Mm,
transparency and things. There might be delicate things, but we need to make sure that we're being as transparent and communicate as effectively as possible.
yeah.
Um, I've seen where things are hidden and other things are going on behind closed doors, they get that sense. It's very obvious. And the more transparent we as an organization generally can be, the better the outcomes are there, I think, for everyone.
I completely agree. I think transparency is key. I think communication is kind. Miscommunication or no communication is unkind. And as it's just a simple, basic thing to communicate. And if you're communicating clearly, honestly, and
Mm.
in a transparent nature, you can't go wrong. And I think keeping an open mind and understanding that employees aren't necessarily struggling just with the one thing that you're dealing with at work. There's a multitude of things going on outside of the workforce that can contribute to how they're acting in the workforce. And all of that needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah.
Finally, we have one last question here, which I am, like I said to them, I'm very grateful for this point of view, and I appreciate them writing this. There are, when it comes to going back to the recognition, there are cultural differences when it comes to recognition. It's interesting. Some cultures don't like to be recognised, and care/caution and awareness needs to be taken. I think that's so important to remember. And like I just said to them, thank you so much for saying that, because like I said, personally for myself, I thrive when somebody tells me I've done a good job, because like I couldn't care less if you gave me a gift, but someone just genuinely saying thank you, that's all it takes. It's like, and I'm stoked. Whereas other people don't like recognition. They don't like the limelight. They don't like somebody telling them something that makes them uncomfortable almost. And I think it's important to remember that. What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and this comes down to the fact that these are people things, and a lot of that is emotional intelligence and understanding how you
Understanding.
communicate with others, and that there's no rule book or line by line thing that you can follow there. I think it does come down to your intuition and your skills as a people person, so HR or safety leader, and having these conversations and being able to recognize those sorts of cultural differences and how you might approach people in terms of your language used and things that you'll do with them.
I also think allowing your staff and your colleagues and your superiors even to know that they can trust you to understand it and allow them a safe space to hear how they're feeling is very important as well.
Yeah, I would say that's probably the biggest element in terms of connections is
Trust,
that
definitely.
sense of trust, and you'll see that play out in everything. Then,
Yeah.
even just the fact that this is, I think, one of the areas where people look at, okay, well, what if they share something really, about something concerning? The fact that they feel safe enough to do that, I think, is a really positive sign, and it allows you then to manage things internally and have discussions internally rather than that stuff going external, which is a worse outcome for everyone,
Exactly.
obviously.
I know for myself at myosh, like a couple of weeks ago, I was having a really tough week, like a personal things going on, hospital, all the things. And I didn't even think twice about spilling the exact reason why I was away, why I was unwell. Like it just all come out, and it's because there's the trust, and it's because there's the respect, and there's the mutual agreement between us all that we can be honest, we can be transparent, we can communicate, and having that in a workplace, I think, takes the most amazing invisible weight off your shoulders that you didn't even realize was there. And it's until you find a workplace that does that for you that you realize, Christ, there's so much other places need to do to get better. And this webinar is an example of little stepping stones and foundational starting points that we can all use to better our workplace and just allow ourselves to think outside the box and think of different aspects and different ways to do things to better our workplaces and essentially better our own lives. Because life is not all about work. However, we spend the majority of our life at work. So it's important to be happy where you are and feel safe, I think.
Exactly.
On that note, I think we should wrap up. Thank you so much, Ian. It was lovely to have you here with us today on behalf of Skodel and chatting to us all. I appreciate everybody who's joined us so much. Thank you so much for your questions. If you have any other questions, Ian's details are up on the screen now. So please screenshot that, reach out to us. We've got your details as well. So we will email you the recording of today's webinar a little bit later on today. Like I said, it's all going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel, our website, as well as our social media accounts as well. So reach out if anybody needs anything. I'm sure Ian will be happy to help you guys, as I would as well. So we'll leave it at that, hey? Thank you again, Ian, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the week.